If you will, let's prophetically speaking, with all of the different scriptures, Ezekiel 38, a lot of people are wondering about that, Jeremiah 49, Isaiah 17, Psalm 83. I mean, you're the perfect guy to bring a scenario. Let's talk about the potential chronological scenario based on what we have in Scripture, based on where we're at right now at this very moment with Israel potentially going out on its own to striking some of that. How would you envision? I know it's fiction here, or it's at least truth fiction in that sense, or it's a scenario, a conjecture. Help us understand a possible scenario of what that would look like.
Okay, and I'll preface it by saying there's a famous old, I think it's a Chinese saying, says, he who lives by the crystal ball walks on a lot of broken glass. Okay, we're not living by a crystal ball. We're living by biblical prophecy. We understand it's accurate, and it's a third of the Bible. And we're looking at stuff right now that has been predicted, I think, for our time, this particular hour of the days we live in. So what I'm going to say is Bill's scenario on how things are going to lie out.
As of today.
Yeah, and the sequence of events prophetically that I believe that I'm watching for. It doesn't mean I'm right. I've got a lot of critics who would disagree with me on this, but you've asked the question, I'm going to lay it out. Okay. I think what's going to happen is Israel, probably alone, but it could be with other allies. They could form a little coalition because, Saudi Arabia doesn't want to deal with Iran's nuclear weapon. America has vowed that, Iran won't get a nuclear weapon. But I think Israel's probably going to go alone, and they're going to strike Iran. They're going to strike them decisively. But Iran is not going to roll over and play rope-a-dope. They're going to come right back at Israel. They're going to call Hezbollah to come right at them, Syria to send chemical weapons in, Hamas. Hamas could send 1,000 missiles from the Gaza day. Hezbollah could send 1,000 or more missiles to the north. Remember, in 2006, there was a 34-day war between Hezbollah and Israel, and Hezbollah lobbed 4,000 missiles over 34 days and kept a lot of Israelis in bomb shelters up in Haifa and stuff for that 30-day period. This is not the same Iran. They've got more advanced precision-guided weapons, missiles. They got 150,000 roughly missiles are the estimates. I think what's going to happen is when that starts to happen, Israel's going to strike the Elam area, which the Elam area is, and this is a prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 49. We talked about verses 34 through 39. Elam has, that's the west coast of Iran. Ancient Elam, when you look at a map of Iran, Persia's mainly Iran, but on the west coast, hugging the Persian Gulf, where the Bushehr region is, where the Bushehr nuclear plants are, that's subject of the prophecy. And as a nuclear disaster, God is fiercely angry, it says, and he brings about a disaster. We've talked about the prophecy before. I don't necessarily want to get into the whole details of it, but it becomes a nuclear disaster. The reason we think it's a nuclear disaster is because after it gets struck, the disaster happens, all the indigenous population has to flee for refuge. It says there'll be no nations where the outcasts of Elam don't go. So it seems to be a humanitarian crisis is sparked. Now, Bushehr nuclear reactor is not necessarily the main target of Israel, because that's not necessarily, they're interested in Fordo and some of the other targets that are clearly enriching uranium for a nuclear weapon. But that area is where the closest area to Israel, where Iran could launch missiles, underground missile silos, portable missile launchers. And I think Israel is going to have to take out that area as this war escalates. And that's going to create Israel getting hit real hard. In Isaiah 17, they're going to destroy Damascus. Isaiah 17:1, they'll destroy Damascus. But that prophecy also says that when they do that, they take a serious hit. It says that in that day, and the viewers who are familiar with Isaiah 17, they need to really acquaint themselves with Isaiah 17 verses 4 through 6. It says, in that day that Damascus is destroyed, and we're told in verse 9 it's destroyed by Israel. The desolation is caused by the children of Israel, Isaiah 17:9. It says, the glory of Jacob will fade. This is not a good picture for Israel. Its fatness in its flesh will become lean, talking about Israel. It'll be like a shaking of an olive tree with 2 or 3 olives in the topmost bough, 4 olives left on the fruitful branches. The imagery that Isaiah points is Israel's taking a hit. An olive tree can have up to 500,000 olives. They're a very common tree in the Middle East and Israel. You picture an olive tree on the image on the map of Israel, and it shakes, and you got two or three olives left in the uppermost branch, meaning northern Israel. What happened to the 500,000 olives, right? 4 or 5 in the fruitful bough. So I think what happens is northern Israel, maybe even down through Tel Aviv, they take a serious hit. They probably have chemical weapons coming in. It's a prison rules fight. They have to take out Damascus. When they take out Damascus, the other Arab countries are going, wow, they just took out an Arab city. What's to stop them from taking out Beirut, Amman, Jordan, Mecca, that sort of thing. And Israel's hurt right now. We need to go after them. And I think that's when you'd have Psalm 83, because those countries are involved in that. And those are legitimate concerns, because we find out in Jeremiah 49 verses 1 through 6 and Zephaniah 2, 8 and 9, verse 8 and 9, that Amman, Jordan actually gets desolated. It becomes a desolate mound. It says there's an alarm of war, and Amman of the Ammonites, which is Amman, Jordan. And it becomes a desolate mound. It says Israel will take possession of its inheritance. Remember, that's part of the promised land all the way into Jordan and beyond into the river Euphrates. So I'm thinking we got Jeremiah 49, the alarm prophecy. That leads to Isaiah 17:1, the destruction of Damascus. That leads to the Arab countries coming against Israel in the final war, complete Psalm 83. And then I think when Israel's won that war, they'll win that war, but they'll take a beating in the process. That's when Russia puts together its predominantly Muslim coalition of Ezekiel 38 and 39, including Iran. Iran doesn't get totally destroyed, but I believe they get compromised as a result of the alarm prophecy. And I think they're going to come down against Israel in Ezekiel 38 and 39 for plunder and booty. That Israel at that time will be dwelling securely, without walls, bars, nor gates, in receipt of great plunder and booty. And that's what Russia's coming after. So it's in a different motive than Psalm 83, which is to take the promised land for themselves, the pastures of God, to have a Palestinian state, that sort of thing. So that's what I'm looking for. We've got books and DVDs on all this stuff through Prophecy Watchers about Psalm 83 and about the nuclear showdown in Iran, in case the viewers want to become more acquainted with these prophecies.